Almost everything that I see that comes out of the floor of Congress from both parties shocks me. And I think what you've seen in Congress is that, people are in both end zones. The fact is that you need someone to take some leadership down there. And I'm disappointed that the president hasn't done that either. I heard you all talking on the way in about, his early parts of his charm offensive. The charm offensive should have started in January of 2009. And the fact that all of a sudden now we're in January, or we're in June rather, of 2013, and we're just talking about a charm offensive and trying to get to know Congress, your 5th year of the presidency. It's a little bit late in the dating game to start to get to know somebody.
First of all, Chris Christie talking about a charm offensive, and second of all, I told you he was at the top of everybody's guest list for news programs. That is Governor Christie slamming President Obama today for his inability or unwillingness to get his hands dirty. This has been a long-running criticism of the president. Who can forget the headlines from bipartisan agreement, Obama isn't schmoozing, to Hill Democrats want more love from President Obama, to is Obama a hands-off president? Is the criticism valid, and does that really make a difference when you're talking about a room full of, at least in theory, adults?
Of course. It's always made a difference in Washington. Teddy Kennedy's talked about it, and Orrin Hatch talked about it, how they got along.
It's never made a difference. In the end, people vote their ideas, their ideologies, and their politics. The notion that you can charm a member of the United States Senate who comes from Wyoming into voting for background checks and guns is staggering.
Richard.
People take this thing seriously.
Richard.
It's all part of positioning for the presidential race, but it has nothing to do with the outcomes. Lyndon Johnson was charming. He's viewed as one of the most effective presidents.
But let me just ask this question, and then I'll turn it over. I'll defer to my colleague here on my right. How do you negotiate or charm someone that ultimately wants to see you fail, and have said defeating you is priority number one? How do you charm them?
O'Brien, how do you do it?
Here's what I'm trying to say. And you guys are going to look up at the clock and say, I brought in race at 6, whatever time it is. I can't wait until Obama is out of office and we get the opportunity to read his take on it. Because he's not going to tell you now. But when he's out of office, we will find out the thoughts of the first black president and how easy that road was for him to negotiate and get along with and work well with others.
Dominic, when I disagree with you, does that make me a racist?
Of course not.
Well, same thing with the president. Oh, Richard! Let's think about this for a second. When you look about a president came in from Chicago to spend his time in the U.S. Senate for a couple of years. In the Senate, he got along with, at that point, Tom Coburn. Someone from the far right. Mm-hmm. No one can argue that point. They get along great. Mm-hmm. But at the same point, once he started going towards the White House, he ran to the left. He stayed away from Republicans. He'd walk out of meetings repeatedly. You hear these stories all the time. When he was in the Senate, negotiating immigration reform, and then afterwards, once he was in the White House, the same thing. He didn't remember how to use the White House. And if you look at what...
Please.
No, they've got...
Healthcare reform.
No.
And end
healthcare reform.
wars.
How many Republicans did he try to schmooze then? They tried to force it because he had 60 in the Senate.
He tried to get Republican votes
the
on that.
The notion that schmoozing is an operative, functional
the
part of succeeding... What? With all due respect...
Richard,
who
think
was
about
charming?
this.
George Pataki?
Richard,
you think he
when you were in the assembly,
Mario Cuomo schmoozed
Richard.
Hey, about this, Elliot Spitzer. Elliot Spitzer doesn't understand the meaning of the word.
What you and Elliot Spitzer do is between you and Elliot Spitzer. I don't need to go there.
That's easy and funny.
This is
Richard,
nonsense.
Richard,
leadership takes different roles and different forms and different times. There's nothing wrong with schmoozing.
Are you going to let me comment on this or not, Richard?
I believe I was on a roll.
You were, but let's try to end the roll and let's get to the discussion.
He's got schmoozing. Go ahead.
So when you were in the assembly, Richard, and you had to put legislation forward and wanted to put legislation forward, and you led the attack on the authorities, different things you did you wake up one day and say, I'm going to charge up the hill? Or did you reach out to other people that were in the assembly from upstate and downstate, Democrats, because the Democrats control the assembly, and say, how do we get this through? Did you reach out to your colleagues in the Senate?
So let me see. Talking to my colleagues is schmoozing?
Well, you have to have a relationship with them. You have to have trust and a bond to be able to have that conversation.
Some people I had that conversation with.
Right.
And some people I said to them, you know, you're with me on this one, aren't you?
There were but you had to build up a base of people you knew, either those you pushed or those that you ingratiated.
Basis, some, almost none of them. on whether I schmooze them.
You couldn't do it all by
Please.
force. No, Richard, you had a long time in the assembly. You had a relationship with many men and women up
Yes,
there.
but that
and you were able to
relationship
bring them
cannot
to
be
your
reduced
support.
down to your favorite word, which is schmooze. Schmoozing is the guy on WFAN who has a sports radio show. It is not the way
We
you
can talk
want
about
to
the
go.
Miami Heat now, Richard. Is that where you're going?
But all the stories we hear about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, as far diametrically on their views as could possibly be, and they had a relationship, and from everything that I've heard, that enabled them to at least forge a compromise where compromise was needed. Don't you think it might help find compromise or middle ground on some of these issues?
If you want to compare Rand Paul and Ted Cruz
Well,
and Mario
why doesn't the
Rubio
comparison
to
work?
Ron, because
Marco
they
Rubio.
have, yeah, whatever his name is, because they have no interest in compromise. Because the
Amen,
politics
Brother
of this
Brodsky.
are no
Amen.
longer, you come to Washington to see what you can get done. The politics of this on the crazy right is you come to Washington to shut down the government,
And cut
one
the
way
budget.
or another.
Cut the budget.
There's no basis for this. The notion
Richard,
that you can
amen, Brother
schmooze
Brodsky.
Rand Paul
Amen,
into
Brother
rational.
Richard, the New York Times had a story the other day, or no, roll call had a story the other day about the Senate gym and how they hang out together and they work out and they spend time together without any
Isn't
staff.
Barack Obama the president of the United States?
Yes.
Isn't he a little busy to be hanging out at the Senate
No,
gymnasium?
but the point, I'm talking about the Senate for a second and the fact that they get along outside
Fine.
of the cloakroom
Fair enough,
and
but-
where they are in the Senate.
Fair enough,
The
but when you're talking about
president-
FaceTime with the president
the
and getting
president
along and playing a round
historically,
of golf,
the president,
This
whether you
same
like,
advice, if given to Governor Christie of New Jersey, would be a change in position for him, where he's an outspoken and effective and tough leader, and Obama is
at the same time.
How about
at the
schmoozing in
same
Jersey?
time-
Would you should
I
Chris
don't-
Christie schmooze?
I don't know what the governor there does with the leaders of the Senate
I
that are
see.
Democrats,
And-
but I'm sure they seem to get along
and
relatively
Rudy
well. with
Giuliani
him.
was a schmoozer?
Oh boy.
Dominic,
Oh,
you
boy.
were in that city hall
Please.
more than I was
Oh
at that
boy.
point.
Yeah, with
But-
Rudy,
but
it was
schmooze,
one
but
way.
the same point.
My way or the highway.
The same thing-
And wait until Obama leaves office and he writes that book.
gonna be
But the-
Remember
but the
what
White
I
House-
hope the editors are
But
writing
don't
down the
forget
time code
what
and the
Christie-
date that I said this, because when Obama leaves the office, he's going to tell you that race was one of the major reasons
Dominic,
why he
let's
was
keep-
not able to work
Dominic,
with the Republicans.
Dominic,
Watch.
that is.
O'Brien?
But
Watch.
What Christie said today was an example of his 2016 messaging. His 2016 messages, he can get along with both sides of the aisle.
Unless
What
you
he gets
disagree with
accomplished-
them. Unless you
Well,
disagree with them.
no,
And
no,
you're on
'cause
the
he's
board.
gonna-
And you're on the boardwalk.
out of 10 things-
and the state troopers have to intervene to stop
Out
you,
of-
to
out
stop
of-
the governor from striking someone who merely disagreed
Out
with
of
him.
10 things he's going to try to get done, and he wants to get done, he will put together coalitions to get
you
that
can't
done.
have it both
And the
ways.
same thing.
Chris
that's
Christie
what
is
you
a
need to do in
schmoozer.
government.
I mean, come on, man.
As we say
He's
in the
a
military,
bully.
lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Okay, well, so
and there's
Obama
a point
should
of that.
schmooze,
But there's
and
a
Christie should punch people out.
But there's
That's
a
fair,
point,
right?
There's a point to bringing people together and getting things done together. And there's other times we have to lead people
I think
and you
we've
decide which
exhausted
ones
this
they
one.
are.
I think we're all schmoozed out in more ways than one, but very interesting, very interesting. Up next, casino gaming. Is it a good or bad bet for New York? That is next when the Schmooze Fest on RFL continues. Stay with us.